I'm reading this because the LibriVox recording is not any good. St. Elmo by Augusta J. Evans. Chapter 1. He stood and measured the earth, and the everlasting mountains were scattered, the perpetual hills did bow. These words of the prophet upon Shigionoth were sung by a sweet, happy, childish voice, and to a strange, wild, anomalous tune, solemn as the Hebrew chant of Deborah, and fully as triumphant. A slender girl of 12 years' growth steadied a pail of water on her head, with both dimpled arms thrown up in ancient classic caryatides attitude, and pausing a moment beside the spring, stood fronting the great golden dawn, watching for the first level ray of the coming sun, and chanting the prayer of Habakkuk. Behind her, in silent grandeur, towered the huge outline of Lookout Mountain, shrouded at summit in gray mist, while center and base showed dense masses of foliage, dim and purplish in the distance, a stern-cowled monk of the Cumberland Brotherhood. Low hills clustered on either side, but immediately in front stretched a wooded plain, and across this the child looked at the flushed sky, rapidly brightening into fiery and blinding radiance, until her wild song walked echoes among the far-off rocks. The holy hush of early morning had rested like a benediction upon the scene, and though nature laid her broad finger over her great lips and waited in reverent silence the advent of the sun, morning among the mountains possessed witchery and glories which filled the heart of the girl with adoration, and called for her lips rude but exultant anthems of praise. The young face lifted toward the cloudless east might have served as a model for a pictured Syriac priestess, one of Baalbek's Vestals, ministering in the olden time in that wondrous and grand temple at Heliopolis. The large black eyes held a singular fascination in their mild, sparkling depths, now full of tender, loving light and childish gladness. And in the flexible red lips curled in lines of orthodox Greek perfection, showing remarkable versatility of expression, while the broad, full, polished forehead with its prominent swelling brows could not fail to recall, to even casual observers, the calm, powerful face of Lorenzo de' Medicis, which, if once looked on, fastens itself upon the heart and brain, to be forgotten no more. Her hair, black, straight, waveless as an Indian's, hung around her shoulders and glistened as the water from the dripping bucket trickled through the wreath of purple morning glories and scarlet cypress, which she had twined about her head, ere lifting the cedar pail to its resting place. She wore a short-sleeved dress of yellow striped homespun, which fell nearly to her ankles, and her little bare feet gleamed pearly white on the green grass and rank dewy creepers that clustered along the margin of the bubbling spring. Her complexion was unusually transparent, and early exercise and mountain air had roughed her cheeks till they matched the brilliant hue of her scarlet crown. A few steps in advance of her stood a large, fierce yellow dog with black, scowling face and ears cut close to his head, a savage, repulsive creature who looked as if he rejoiced in an opportunity of making his name. Grip. In the solemn beauty of that summer morning, the girl seemed to have forgotten the mission upon which she came, but as she loitered, the sun flashed up, kindling diamond fringes on every dew-based chestnut leaf and oak bough, and silvering the misty mantle which enveloped Lookout. A moment longer, that pure-hearted Tennessee child stood watching the gorgeous spectacle, drinking draughts of joy, which mingled no drop of sin or selfishness in its crystal waves, for she had grown up alone with nature, utterly ignorant of the roar and strife, the burning hate and cunning intrigue of the great world of men and women where, like an Egyptian picture of tamed vipers, each struggles to get its head above the other. To her, earth seemed very lovely. Life stretched before her like the sun's path in that clear sky, and as free from care or foreboding as the fair June day, she walked on, preceded by her dog, and the chant burst once more from her lips. He stood and measured the earth, and the everlasting mountains were scattered in the perpetual hills. Then sudden, almost simultaneous report of 2 pistol shots rang out sharply on the cool, calm air, and startled the child so violently that she sprang forward and dropped the bucket. The sound of voices reached her from the thick wood bordering the path, and without reflection, she followed the dog, who bounded off toward the point whence it issued. Upon the verge of the forest she paused, and looking down a dewy green glade, where the rising sun darted the earliest arrowy rays, beheld a spectacle which burned itself indelibly upon her memory. A group of 5 gentlemen stood beneath the dripping chestnut and sweet gum arches. One leaned against the trunk of a tree, 2 were conversing eagerly in undertones, and 2 faced each other 15 paces apart, with pistols in their hands. Ere she could comprehend the scene, the brief conference ended. The seconds resumed their places to witness another fire, and like the peal of a trumpet echoed the words, "Fire! 1, 2, 3!" The flash and ringing report mingled with the command, and one of the principals threw up his arm and fell. When with horror, her wide-stained eyes and pallor on her lips, the child staggered to the spot and looked on the prostrate form, he was dead. The hazel eyes stared blankly at the sky, and the hue of life and exuberant health still glowed on the full cheek, but the ball had entered the heart, and the warm blood bubbling from his breast dripped on the glistening grass. The surgeon, who knelt beside him, took the pistol from his clenched fingers and gently pressed the lids over his glazing eyes. Not a word was uttered, but while the second sadly regarded the stiffening form, the surviving principal coolly drew out a cigar, lighted and placed it between his lips. The child's eyes had wandered to the ladder from the pool of blood, and now in a shuddering cry she broke the silence. "Murderer!" The party looked around instantly, and for the first time perceived her standing there in their midst, with loathing and horror in the gaze she fixed on the perpetrator of the awful deed. In great surprise, he drew back a step or 2, and asked gruffly, "Who are you? What business have you here?" "Oh, how dared you murder him? Do you think God will forgive you on the gallows?" He was a man probably 27 years of age, singularly fair, handsome, and hardened in iniquity, but he cowered before the blanched and accusing face of the appalled child, and ere a reply could be framed, his friend came close to him. "Clinton, you had better be off. You have barely time to catch the Knoxville train, which leaves Chattanooga in half an hour. I would advise you to make a long stay in New York, for there will be trouble when Dent's brother hears of this morning's work." "Aye, take my word for that, and put the Atlantic between you and Dick Dent," added the surgeon, smiling grimly, as if the anticipation of retributive justice afforded him pleasure. "I will simply put this between us," replied the homicide, fitting his pistol to the palm of his hand. As he did so, a heavy antique diamond ring flashed on his little finger. "Come, Clinton. Delay may cause you more trouble than we bargained for," urged his second. Without even glancing toward the body of his antagonist, Clinton scowled at the child, and turning away, was soon out of sight. "Oh, sir, will you let him get away? Will you let him go unpunished?" "He cannot be punished," answered the surgeon, looking at her with a mingled curiosity and admiration. "I thought men were hung for murder." "Yes, but this is not murder." "Not murder? He shot him dead! What is it?" "He killed him in a duel, which is considered quite right and altogether proper." "A duel?" She had never heard the word before, and pondered an instant. "To take a man's life is murder. Is there no law to punish a duel?" "None strong enough to prohibit the practice. It is regarded as the only method of honorable satisfaction open to gentlemen." "Honorable satisfaction?" she repeated, weighing the new phraseology as cautiously and fearfully as she would have handled the bloody garments of the victim. "What is your name?" asked the surgeon. "Edna Earle." "Do you live near this place?" "Yes, sir, very near." "Is your father at home?" "I have no father, but Grandpa has not gone to the shop yet." "Will you show me the way to the house?" "Do you wish to carry him there?" she asked, glancing at the corpse and shuddering violently. "Yes, I want some assistance from your grandfather." "I will show you the way, sir." The surgeon spoke hurriedly to the 2 remaining gentlemen, and followed his guide. Slowly she retraced her steps, refilled her bucket at the spring, and walked on before the stranger. But the glory of the morning had passed away. A bloody mantle hung between the splendor of summer sunshine and the chilled heart of the awe-struck girl. The forehead of the radiant, holy June day had been suddenly red-branded like Cain, to be struck henceforth an occasion of hideous reminiscences. And with blanched face and trembling lips, the child followed a narrow, beaten path, which soon terminated at the gate of a rude, unwhitewashed paling. A low, comfortless-looking three-roomed house stood within, and on the steps sat an elderly man smoking a pipe and busily engaged in mending a bridle. The creaking of the gate attracted his attention, and he looked up, wonderingly, at the advancing stranger. "Oh, Grandpa, there is a murdered man lying in the grass, under the chestnut trees, down by the spring." "Why, how do you know he was murdered?" "Good morning, sir. Your granddaughter happened to witness a very unfortunate and distressing affair. A duel was fought at sunrise in the edge of the woods yonder, and the challenged party, Mr. Dent of Georgia, was killed. I came to ask permission to bring the body here until arrangements can be made for its interment, and also to beg your assistance in obtaining a coffin." Edna passed on to the kitchen, and as she deposited the bucket on the table, a tall, muscular, red-haired woman, who was stooping over the fire, raised her flushed face and exclaimed angrily, "What upon earth have you been doing? I have been halfway to the spring to call you, and hadn't a drop of water in the kitchen to make coffee. A pretty time of day Aaron Hunt will get his breakfast. What do you mean by such idleness?" She advanced with threatening mien and gesture, but stopped suddenly. "Edna, what ails you? Have you gotten ague? You're as white as the pan of a flower. Are you scared or sick? There was a man killed this morning, and the body will be brought here directly. If you want to hear about it, you better go out on the porch. One of the gentlemen is talking to Grandpa." Stunned by what she had seen and indisposed to narrate the horrid details, the girl went to her own room, and seating herself in the window, tried to collect her thoughts. She was tempted to believe the whole affair a hideous dream, which would pass away with vigorous rumbling of her eyes, but the crushed purple and scarlet flowers she took from her forehead, her dripping hair and damp feet assured her of the vivid reality of the vision. Every fiber of her frame had received a terrible shock, and when noisy, bustling Mrs. Hunt ran from room to room, ejaculating her astonishment and calling on the child to assist in putting the house in order, the latter obeyed silently, mechanically, as if in a state of somnambulism. Mr. Dent's body was brought upon a rude litter of boards, and temporarily placed on Edna's bed, and toward evening, when a coffin arrived from Chattanooga, the remains were removed, and the coffin rested on 2 chairs in the middle of the same room. The surgeon insisted upon an immediate interment near the scene of combat, but the gentleman who had officiated as second for the deceased expressed his determination to carry the unfortunate man's body back to his home and family, and the earliest train on the following day was appointed as the time for their departure. Late in the afternoon, Edna cautiously opened the door of the room, which she had hitherto avoided, and with her apron full of lilies, while poppies and sprigs of rosemary approached the coffin and looked at the rigid sleeper, judging from his appearance, not more than 30 years had gone over his handsome head. His placid features were unusually regular, and a soft, silky brown beard fell upon his pulseless breast. Fearful lest she should touch the icy form, the girl timidly strewed her flowers in the coffin, and tears gathered and dropped with the blossoms as she noticed a plain gold ring on the little finger, and wondered if he were married, if his death would leave wailing orphans in his home, and a broken-hearted widow at the desolate hearthstone. Absorbed in her melancholy task, she heard neither the sound of strange voices in the passage, nor the faint creak of the door as it swung back on its rusty hinges, but a shrill scream, a wild, despairing shriek terrified her, and her heart seemed to stand still as she bounded away from the side of the coffin. The light of the setting sun streamed through the window and over the white, convulsed face of a feeble but beautiful woman, who was supported on the threshold by a venerable gray-haired man, down whose furrowed cheeks tears coursed rapidly. Struggling to free herself from his restraining grasp, the stranger tottered into the middle of the room. "Oh, Harry, my husband, my husband!" She threw up her wasted arms and fell forward senseless on the corpse. They bore her into the adjoining apartment, where the surgeon administered the usual restoratives, and though finally the pulses stirred and throbbed feebly, no symptom of returning consciousness greeted the anxious friends who bent over her. Hour after hour passed, during which she lay motionless as her husband's body, and at length the physician sighed, and pressing his fingers to his eyes, said sorrowfully to the grief-stricken old man beside her, "It is paralysis, Mr. Dent, and there is no hope. She may linger 12 or 24 hours, but her sorrows are ended. She and Harry will soon be reunited. Knowing her constitution, I feared as much. You should not have suffered her to come. You might have known that the shock would kill her. For this reason, I wished his body buried here. I could not restrain her. Some meddling gossip told her that my poor boy had gone to fight a duel, and she rose from her bed and started to the railroad depot. I plunged, I reasoned with her that she could not bear the journey, but I might as well have talked to the winds. I never knew her obstinate before, but she seemed to have a presentiment of the truth. God pity her two sweet babes." The old man bowed his head upon her pillow and sobbed aloud. Throughout the night, Edna crouched beside the bed, watching the wan but lovely face of the young widow, and tenderly chafing the numb, fair hands which lay so motionless on the coverlet. Children are always sanguine because of their ignorance of the stern, inexorable realities of the untried future, and Edna could not believe that death would snatch from the world one so beautiful and so necessary to her prattling, fatherless infants. But morning showed no encouraging symptoms. The stupor was unbroken, and at noon the wife's spirit passed gently into the everlasting reunion. Before sunrise on the ensuing day, a sad group clustered once more under the dripping chestnuts, and where a pool of blood had dyed the sod, a wide grave yawned. The coffins were lowered, the bodies of Henry and Helen Dent rested side by side, and as the mound rose slowly above them, the solemn silence was broken by the faltering voice of the surgeon, who read the burial service. "Man that is born of woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up, and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay. Yet, O Lord God most holy, O Lord most mighty, O holy and most merciful Savior, deliver us not into the pains of eternal death." The melancholy rite ended. The party dispersed. The strangers took their departure for their distant homes, and quiet reigned once more in the small dark cottage. But days and weeks brought Edna no oblivion of the tragic events which constituted the first great epoch of her monotonous life. A nervous restlessness took possession of her. She refused to occupy her old room, and insisted upon sleeping on a pallet at the foot of her grandfather's bed. She forsook her whilom haunts about the spring and forest, and started up in terror at every sudden sound, while from each opening between the chestnut trees and the hazel eyes of the dead man and the wan, thin face of the golden-haired wife looked out beseechingly at her. Frequently, in the warm light of day, ere shadows stalked to and fro in the thick woods, she would steal with an apron full of wildflowers to the solitary grave, scatter her treasures in the rank grass that waved above it, and hurry away with hushed breath and quivering limbs. Summer waned, autumn passed, and winter came, but the girl recovered in no degree from the shock which had cut short her chant of praise on that bloody June day. In her morning visit to the spring, she had stumbled upon a monster which custom had adopted and petted, which the passions and sinfulness of men had adroitly draped and fondled, and called honorable satisfaction, but her pure, unperverted, ethereal nature pierced the conventional mask, recognized the loathsome lineaments of crime, and recoiled in horror and amazement, wondering at the wickedness of her race and the forbearance of outraged Jehovah. Innocent childhood had for the first time stood face to face with sin and death, and could not forget vision. Edna Earle had lost both her parents before she was old enough to remember either. Her mother was the only daughter of Aaron Hunt, the village blacksmith, and her father, who was an intelligent, promising young carpenter, accidentally fell from the roof of the house, which he was shingling, and died from the injuries sustained. Thus Mr. Hunt, who had been widower for nearly 10 years, found himself burdened with the care of an infant only 6 months old. His daughter had never left him, and after her death the loneliness of the house oppressed him painfully, and for the sake of his grandchild he resolved to marry again. The middle-aged widow whom he selected was a kind-hearted and generous woman, but indolent, ignorant, and exceedingly high-tempered, and while she really loved the little orphan committed to her care, she contrived to alienate her affection and to tighten the bonds of union between her husband and the child. Possessing a remarkably amiable and equable disposition, Edna rarely vexed Mrs. Hunt, who gradually left her more and more to the indulgence of her own views and caprices, and contented herself with exacting a certain amount of daily work, after the accomplishments of which she allowed her to amuse herself as childish whims dictated. There chanced to be no children of her own age in the neighborhood. Consequently, she grew up without companionship, save that furnished by her grandfather, who was dotingly fond of her, and would have her utterly spoiled her, had not her temperament fortunately been one not easily injured by unrestrained liberty of action. Before she was able to walk, he would take her to the forge, and keep her for hours on a sheepskin in one corner, when she watched with infantile delight the blast of the furnace and the shower of sparks that fell from the anvil, and where she often slept, lulled by the monotonous chorus of trip and sledge. As she grew older, the mystery of bellows and slack tub engaged her attention, and at one end of the shop, on a pile of shavings, she collected a mass of curiously shaped bits of iron and steel, and blocks of wood from which a miniature shop threatened to rise in rivalry, and finally, when strong enough to grasp the handles of the bellows, her great pleasure consisted in rendering the feeble assistance which her grandfather was always so proud to accept at her hands. Although ignorant and uncultivated, Mr. Hunt was a man of warm, tender feelings, and rare nobility of soul. He regretted the absence of early advantages which poverty had denied him, and in teaching Edna to read and write, and to cipher, he never failed to impress upon her the vast superiority which a thorough education confers. Whether his exhortations first kindled in her ambition, or whether her aspiration for knowledge was spontaneous and irrepressible, he knew not, but she manifested very early a fondness for study and thirst for learning, which he gratified to the fullest extent of his limited ability. The blacksmith's library consisted of the family Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, a copy of Irving's Sermons on Parables, Guy Mannering, a few tracts, and 2 books which had belonged to an itinerant minister who preached occasionally in the neighborhood, and who, having died rather suddenly at Mr. Hunt's house, left the volumes in his saddlebags, which were never claimed by his family, residing in a distant state. Those books were Plutarch's Lives and a worn school copy of Anton's Classical Dictionary, and to Edna they proved a literary ophir of inestimable value and exhaustless interest. Plutarch especially was a Pisgah of letters, when the vast domain of learning, the Canaan of human wisdom, stretched alluringly before her, and as often as she climbed this height and viewed the wondrous scene beyond, it seemed, indeed, an arch where though gleams that untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and ever, and forever and forever, when we move. In after years, she sometimes questioned if this mount of observation was also that of temptation, to which ambition had led her spirit, and there bargained for and bought her future. Love of nature, love of books, and earnest piety, and deep religious enthusiasm were characteristics of a noble young soul left astray through the devious, checkered paths of life without other guidance than that which she received from communion with Greek sages and Hebrew prophets. An utter stranger to fashionable conventionality and latitudinarian ethics, it was no marvel that the child stared and shivered when she saw the laws of God vetoed, and was blandly introduced to murder as honorable satisfaction. Chapter 2. Nearly a mile from the small straggling village of Chattanooga stood Aaron Hunt's shop, shaded by a grove of oak and chestnut trees which grew upon the knoll where two roads intersected. Like the majority of blacksmith shops at country crossroads, it was a low, narrow shed filled with dust and rubbish, with old wheels and new trees, broken pillows, and dilapidated wagons awaiting repairs, and at the rear of the shop stood a smaller shed where an older gray horse quietly ate his corn and fodder, waiting to carry the master to his home, 2 miles distant, as soon as the sun had set beyond the neighboring mountain. Early in winter, having an unusual amount of work on hand, Mr. Hunt hurried away from the home one morning, neglecting to take the bucket which contained his dinner, and Edna was sent to repair the oversight. Accustomed to ramble about the woods without companionship, she walked leisurely along the rocky road, swinging the tin bucket in one hand, and pausing now and then to watch the shy red birds that flitted like flame jets in and out of the trees as she passed. The unbroken repose of earth and sky, the cold, still atmosphere and peaceful sunshine touched her heart with a sense of quiet but pure happiness, and half unconsciously, as she began a hymn which her grandfather often sang over his anvil, Lord, in the morning thou shalt hear my voice ascending high. To thee will I direct my prayer, to thee lift up mine eye. Ere the first verse was ended, the clatter of a horse's hoofs hushed her song, and she glanced up as a harsh voice asked impatiently, Are you stone deaf, I say? Is there a blacksmith's shop near? The rider reined in his horse, a sputtered, beautiful animal, and waited for an answer. Yes, sir. There's a shop about a half a mile ahead, on the right-hand side, where the road forks. He just touched his hat with the end of his gloved fingers and galloped on. When Edna reached the shop, she saw her grandfather examining the horse's shoes. While the stranger walked up and down the road before the forge, he was a very tall, strong man, with a gray shawl thrown over one shoulder, and a black fur hat drawn so far over his face that only the lower portion was visible, and this, swarthy and harsh, left a most disagreeable impression on the child's mind as she passed him and went up to the spot where Mr. Hunt was at work. Putting the bucket behind her, she stopped, kissed him on his furrowed forehead, and said, Grandpa, guess what brought me to see you today? I forgot my dinner, and you have trudged over here to bring it. Ain't I right, Pearl? Stand back, honey, or this Satan of a horse may kick your brains out. I can hardly manage him. Here the stranger uttered an oath and called out, How much longer do you intend to keep me waiting? No longer, sir, than I can help, as I like the company of polite people. Oh, Grandpa, whispered Edna, deprecatingly, as she saw the traveler come rapidly forward and throw his shawl down on the grass. Mr. Hunt pushed back his old battered woolen hat and looked steadily at the master of the horse, saying gravely and resolutely, I'll finish the job as soon as I can, and that is as much as any reasonable man would ask. Now, sir, if that doesn't suit you, you can take your horse and put out, and swear at somebody else, for I won't stand it. It is a cursed nuisance to be detained here for such a trifle as one shoe, and you might hurry yourself. Your horse is very restless and vicious, and I could shoe 2 gentle ones while I am trying to quiet him. The man muttered something indistinctly, and laying his hand on heavily on the horse's mane, said very sternly a few words which were utterly unintelligible to his human listeners, though they certainly exaggerated a magical influence over the fiery creature, who, savage as the pampered pets of Diomedes, soon stood tranquil and contented, rubbing his head against his master's shoulder. Repelled by the rude harshness of this man, Edna walked into the shop and watched the silent group outside until the work was finished and Mr. Hunt threw down his tools and wiped his face. "What do I owe you?" said the impatient rider, springing to his saddle and putting his hand to his vest pocket. "I charge nothing for such trifles as that. But I am in the habit of paying for my work." "It is not worth talking about. Good day, sir." Mr. Hunt turned and walked into the shop. "There is $1. It is the only small change I have." He rode up to the door of the shed, threw the small gold coin toward the blacksmith, and was riding rapidly away, when Edna darted after him, exclaiming, "Stop, sir! You have left your shawl." He turned in the saddle, and even under the screen of her calico bonnet, she felt the fiery gleam of his eyes as he stooped to take the shawl from her hands. Once more his fingers touched his hat. He bowed and said hastily, "I thank you, child." Then, spurring his horse, he was out of sight in a moment. "He is a rude, blasphemous, wicked man," said Mr. Hunt as Edna returned to the shop and picked up the coin, which lay glistening amid the cinders around the anvil. "Why do you think him wicked?" "No good man swears as he did before you came, and didn't you notice the vicious, wicked expression of his eyes?" "No, sir. I did not see much of his face. He never looked at me but once. I should not like to meet him again. I am afraid of him." "Never fear, Pearl. He is a stranger here, and there is little chance of your ever setting your eyes on his ugly, savage face again. Keep the money, dear. I won't have it as all the airs he put on. If instead of shoeing his wild brute, I had knocked the fellow down for his insolence and cursing me, it would have served him right. Politeness is a cheap thing, and a poor man, if he behaves himself and does his work well, is as much entitled to it as the president." "I will give the $1 to Grandma to buy a new coffee pot, for she had said today the old one was burnt out, and she could not use it any longer." "But what is that yonder on the grass? The man left something after all." She picked up from the spot where he had thrown his shawl a handsome morocco-bound pocket copy of Dante, and opening it to discover the name of the owner, she saw written on the fly-leaf in a bold and beautiful hand, S.E.M. Boboli Gardens, Florence. Lassicate ogni speranza voi ci entrate. "What does this mean, Grandpa?" She held up the book and pointed out the words of the dread inscription. "Indeed, Pearl, how should I know? It is Greek or Latin or Dutch, like the other outlandish gibberish he talked to that devil horse. He must have spent his life among the heathens, to judge from his talk, for he has neither manner nor religion. Honey, better put the book there in the furnace. It is not fit for your eyes." "He may come back for it if he misses it pretty soon." "Not he. One might almost believe he was running from the law. He would not turn back for it if it was bound in gold instead of leather. It is no account, I'll warrant, or he would not have been reading it, the ill-mannered heathen." Weeks passed as the owner was not heard from again. Edna felt that she might justly claim as her own this most marvelous of books, which, though beyond her comprehension, furnished a source of endless wonder and delight. The copy was Gary's translation, with illustrations designed by Flaxman, and many of the grand, gloomy passages were underlined by pencil and annotated in the unknown tongue, which so completely baffled her curiosity. Night and day she pored over this new treasure, sometimes dreaming of the hideous faces that scowled at her from the solemn, mournful pages, and anon, when startled from sleep by these awful visions, she would soothe herself to rest by murmuring the metrical version of the Lord's Prayer contained in the Purgatory. Most emphatically did Mrs. Hunt disapprove of the studious and contemplative habits of the ambitious child, who she averred was indulging dreams and aspirations far above her station in life, and well calculated to dissatisfy her with her humble, unpretending home and uninviting future. Education, she contended, was useless to poor people, who could not feed and clothe themselves with book learning, and experience had taught her that those who lounged about with books in their hands generally came to want, and invariably to harm. It was as in vain that she endeavored to convince her husband of the impropriety of permitting the girl to spend so much time over her books. He finally put the matter at rest by declaring that, in his opinion, Edna was a remarkable child, and, if well educated, might even rise to the position of teacher for the neighborhood, which would confer most honorable distinction upon the family. Laying his brawny hand fondly over her head, he said tenderly, "Let her alone, wife, let her alone. You will make us proud of you, won't you, little Pearl? When you are smart enough to teach a school, I shall be too old to work by that time, and you will take care of me, won't you, my little mockingbird?" "Oh, Grandy, that I will. But do you really think I shall ever have sense enough to be a teacher? You know I ought to learn everything, and I have so few books." "To be sure you will. Remember, there is always a way where there's a will. When I pay off the debt I owe Peter Wood, I will see that what we can do about some new books. Put on your shawl now, Pearl, and hunt up old Brindle. It is milking time, and she is not in sight." "Grandpa, are you sure you feel better this evening?" She plunged her fingers in his thick white hair and rubbed her round rosy cheek softly against his. "Oh, yes, I am better. Hurry back, Pearl. I want you to read to me." It was a bright day in January, and the old man sat in a large rocking chair on the porch smoking his pipe, and, sunning himself in the last rays of the sinking sun. He had complained all day of not feeling well, and failed to go to his work as usual, and now, as his grandchild tied her pink calico bonnet under her chin and wrapped herself in her faded plaid shawl, he watched her with a tender, loving light in his keen gray eyes. She kissed him, buttoned her shirt collar, which had become unfastened, drew his homespun coat closer to his throat, and springing down the steps bounded away in search of the cow, who often strayed so far that she was dispatched to drive her home. In the grand, peaceful, solemn woods, through which the wintry wind now sighed in a soothing monotone, the child's spirit reached an exaltation which had she lived to 2,000 years earlier, and roamed amid the vales and vastness of classical Arcadia, would have vented itself in dithyrambics to the great Lord of Hyle, the Greek All, the horned and hooved god Pan, in every age and among all people, from the Parsi devotees and the Gosains of India, and the pantheism of Bruno Spinoza and New England's Illuminati. Nature has been apothecized, and the heart of the blacksmith's untutored darling stirred with the same emotions of awe and adoration which thrilled the worshippers of Hertha when the veiled chariot stood in Helgeland, and which made the groves of the grottos of Phrygia sacred to Dindymene. Edna loved trees and flowers, stars and clouds, with warm, clinging affection, as she loved those of her own race. And that solace and amusement which most children find in the society of children and the sports of childhood, this girl derived from the solitude and serenity of nature. To her woods and fields were indeed very vocal, and every fluttering bird and gurgling brook, every passing cloud and whispering breeze brought messages of God's eternal love and wisdom, and drew her tender, yearning heart more closely to Jehovah, the Lord God omnipotent. Today, the boundless reverence and religious enthusiasm of her character, she directed her steps to the large spreading oak, now leafless, where in summer she often came to read and pray, and here, falling on her knees, she thanked God for the blessings showered upon her. Entirely free from discontent and querulousness, she was thoroughly happy in her poor, humble home, and over all, like a consecration, shone the devoted love for her grandfather, which more than compensated for any want of which she might otherwise have been conscious. Accustomed always to ask special favor for him, his name now passed her lips in earnest supplication, and she fervently thanked the Father that his threatened illness had been arrested without serious consequences. The sun had gone down when she rose and hurried on in search of the cow. The shadows of a winter evening gathered in the forest and climbed like trooping spirits up the rocky mountain side. As she plunged deeper and deeper into the woods, the child began a wild cattle call that she was wont to use on such occasions. The echoes rang out a weird Brocken chorus, and at last, when she was growing impatient of the fruitless search, she paused to listen, and heard the welcome sound of the familiar lowing, by which the old cow recognized her summons. Following the sound, Edna soon saw the missing favorite coming slowly toward her, and ere many moments both were running homeward. As she approached the house, driving Brindle before her, and merrily singing her rude Ransdish vashes, the moon rose full and round and threw a flood of light over the porch where the blacksmith still sat. Edna took off her bonnet and waved at him, but he did not seem to notice the signal, and driving the cow into the yard, she called out as she latched the gate, "Grandy dear, why don't you go into the fire? Are you waiting for me out here in the cold? I think Brindle certainly must have been cropping grass around the old walls of Jericho, as that is the farthest off of any place I know. If she is as tired and hungry as I am, she ought to be glad to get home." He did not answer, and running up the steps, she thought he had fallen asleep. The old woolen hat shaded his face, but when she crept on tiptoe to the chair, stooped, put her arms around him, and kissed his wrinkled cheek, she stared back in terror. The eyes stared at the moon, the stiff fingers clutched the pipe from which the ashes had not been shaken, and the face was cold and rigid. Aaron Hunt had indeed fallen asleep, to wake no more amid the storm and woes and tears of time. Edna fell on her knees and grasped the icy hands. "Grandpa, wake up! Oh, Grandpa, speak to me! Your little Pearl, wake up, dear Grandy! I have come back! My Grandpa, oh!" A wild, despairing cry rent still the evening air, and shrieked dismally back from the distant hills and the gray, ghostly mountain, and the child fell on her face at the dead man's feet. Throughout that dreary night of agony, Edna lay on the bed where her grandfather's body had been placed, holding one of the stiffened hands folded in both hers, and pressed against her lips. She neither wept nor moaned. The shock was too terrible to admit of noisy grief, but completely stunned, she lay mute and desolate. For the first time in her life, she could not pray. She wanted to turn away from the thought of God and heaven, for it seemed that she had nothing left to pray for. That silver-haired, wrinkled old man was the only father she had ever known. He had cradled her in his sinewy arms and slept clasping her to his heart, had taught her to walk, and surrounded her with his warm, pitying love, making a home of peace and blessedness for her young life, giving him in return the whole wealth of her affection. He had become the center of all her hopes, joys, and aspirations. Now what remained? Bitter, rebellious feelings hardened her heart when she remembered that, even while she was kneeling, thanking God for his preservation from illness, he had already passed away. Nay, his sanctified spirit probably poised its wings close to the ethereal throne, and listened to the prayer which she sent up to God for his welfare and happiness and protection while on earth. The souls of our dead need not the aid of Sandalphon to interpret the whispers that rise tremulously from the world of sin and wrestling, that float up among the stars through the gates of pearl, down the golden streets of New Jerusalem. So we all trust and prate of our faith, and deceive ourselves with the fond hope that we are resigned to the heavenly will, and we go on with a show of Christian resilience. While the morning sun smiles in gladness and plenty, the hymn of happy days and the dear voices of our loved ones make music in our ears, and lo, God puts us in the crucible. The light of life, the hope of all future years, is blotted out. Clouds of despair and the grim night of an unlifting desolation fall like a pall on heart and brain. We dare not look heavenward, dreading another blow. Our anchor drags. We lift out into a hideous dead sea, where our idol has gone down forever. and boasted faith and trust and patience are swept like straws from our grasp in the tempest of woe, while our human love cries wolfishly for its lost darling. Ah, we build grand and gloomy mausoleums for our precious dead hopes, but like Artemisia, we refuse to sepulchre. We devour the bitter ashes of the lost, and grimly and audaciously challenge Jehovah to take the worthless, mutilated life that his wisdom reserves for other aims and future toils. Job's wife is immortal and ubiquitous, haunting the sorrow-shrouded chamber of every stricken human soul, and fiendishly prompting the bleeding, crushed spirit to curse God and die. Edna had never contemplated the possibility of her grandfather's death. It was a horror she had never forced herself to front, and now that he was cut down in an instant, without even the mournful consolation of parting words and farewell kisses, she asked herself again and again, "What have I done that God should punish me so? I thought I was grateful. I thought I was doing my duty, but oh, what a dreadful sin I have committed to deserve this awful affliction." During the long, ghostly watches of that winter night, she recalled her past life, gilded by the old man's love, and could no longer could remember no happiness with which he was not intimately connected, and no sorrow that his hand had not soothed and lighted. The future was now blank, crossed by no projected paths, lit with no ray of hope, and at daylight, when the cold, pale morning showed the stony face of the corpse at her side, her unnatural composure broke up in a storm of passionate woe, and she sprang to her feet, almost frantic with the sense of her loss. All alone, nobody to love me, nothing to look forward to. Oh, Grandpa, did you hear me praying for you yesterday? Dear Grandy, my own dear Grandy, I did pray for you while you were dying, here alone. Oh, my God, what have I done, that you should take him away from me? Was I not on my knees when he died? Oh, what will become of me now? Nobody to care for Edna now. Oh, Grandpa, beg Jesus to ask God to take me too. And throwing up her clasped hands, she sank back insensible on the shrouded form of the dead. When some beloved voice, that was to you both sound and sweetness, faileth suddenly, and silence against which you dare not cry, aches round you like a strong disease and new, what hope, what help, what music will undo that silence of your senses, to your senses? Not friendship's sigh, not reason's subtle count, nay, none of these. Speak thou, availing Christ, and fill this pause. Chapter 3. Of all that occurred during many ensuing weeks, Edna knew little. She retained in after years only a vague, confused remembrance of keen anguish and utter prostration, and an abiding sense of irreparable loss. In delirious visions she saw her grandfather now struggling in the grasp of Phlegias, and now writhing in the fiery tomb of Uberti, with jets of flame leaping through his white hair, and his shrunken hands stretched appealingly toward her, as she had seen those of the doomed Ghibelline leader in the hideous Dante picture. All the appalling images evoked by the somber and embittered imagination of the gloomy Tuscan had seized upon her fancy, even in happy hours, and were now reproduced by her disordered brain in multitudinous and aggravated forms. Her wails of agony, her passionate prayers to God, released the beloved spirit from the tortures which her delirium painted, were painful beyond expression to those who watched her ravings, and it was with a feeling of relief that they finally saw her sink into apathy, into a quiet mental stupor from which nothing seemed to rouse her. She did not remark Mrs. Hunt's absence, or the presence of the neighbors at her bedside, and one morning, when she was wrapped up and placed by the fire, Mrs. Wood told her as gently as possible that her grandmother had died from a disease which was ravaging the country, and supposed to be cholera. The intelligence produced no emotion. She merely looked up an instant, glanced mournfully around the dreary room, and, shivering slightly, drooped her head again on her hand. Week after week went slowly by, and she was removed to Mrs. Wood's house, but no improvement was discernible, and the belief became general that the child's mind had sunk into hopeless imbecility. The kind-hearted miller and his wife endeavored to coax her out of her chair by the chimney corner, but she crouched there, a wan, mute figure of woe, pitiable to contemplate, asking no questions, causing no trouble, receiving no consolation. One bright March morning she sat as usual, with her face bowed on her hand, and her vacant gaze fixed on the blazing fire, when, through the open window, came the impatient lowing of a cow. Mrs. Wood saw a change pass swiftly over the girl's face, and quiver across the lips so long frozen. She lifted her head, rose, and followed the sound, and soon stood at the side of Brindle, who now furnished milk for the miller's family. As the gentle cow recognized and looked at her, with an expression almost human in the mild, liquid eyes, all the events of that last serene evening swept back to Edna's deadened memory, and, leaning her head on Brindle's horns, she shed the first tears that had flowed for her great loss, while sobs, thick and suffocating, shook her feeble, emaciated frame. "Bless the poor little outcast,"